tradition. The reason that we're using this guide is because it is one of the most celebrated in Islamic history. Even in the contemporary Muslim world, people read it, and not only read it, but memorize it and digest it, every sentence of it, in different parts of the world. And that it is probably one of the most succinct guides that has ever been written on the spiritual path. The most profound yet very succinct guide. And so it's a good place to at least begin and to constantly come back to. So inshallah today what we're going to try to do in the next 2 hours is we're going to try to cover the last 3 chapters, which starts on page 117, and it begins with the concept of zuhud, renunciation, and it goes to the concept of reliance, which is tawakkul, and then it goes to the concept of divine love and contentment, which is muhabba. And so all of these concepts are very heavy and very important for us to properly understand. Inshallah, we'll be able to do some of that today. And we'll leave questions for the end. If there's questions about anything that was said previously or anything that you read in your assigned chapters that we didn't go over together in class, or anything from today, we'll leave it for the end so that we can at least try to get through these 3 chapters together, inshallah, in the remaining time that we have. And just as a reminder, I've said this many times, but I think it's worth repeating. The reason that we covered the chapters that we did is not because they are somehow more important than the chapters that we did not cover, but perhaps they need a little bit more explanation and a little bit more group reflection and study. And particularly the chapters that we chose to go over are the 9 veils that Imam al-Haddad identifies in his other texts as being the veils that separate our hearts from illumination, that separate our hearts from Allah Ta'ala's light. And light is, the power of Allah Ta'ala's light is that it is faith itself. And so, we covered the first 4 chapters, we're covering the heavy veils, as Imam al-Haddad calls it, and then the last several chapters that we've been covering are considered the lighter veils, as Imam al-Haddad calls it. And so today we'll be covering 4 of those last 9 veils. And it begins with zuhud, and then it goes to tawakkul, and then there's 2 concepts of love and contentment. So inshallah, let's begin our reading of this. Page 117. Bismillah. You must renounce the world, for renunciation is the forerunner of felicity, the manifestation of providence, and the sign of sanctity. So at the very onset, Imam al-Haddad is saying something that is quite heavy, and that might be quite striking and shocking to some people, especially given our immersing in the world and its activities. That he says, you must renounce the world. And this requires some level of thought and explanation, because perhaps one could even argue that the world is not the best translation that we can use when we are referring to what is often called the dunya. Allah Ta'ala refers to this in his most noble book. It is referred by the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, and is referred to in many of the spiritual texts. And so when we say you must renounce the world, then the perception that a lot of people get, I think quite wrongly, is that the spiritual path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is about removing ourselves and our concerns and our activities completely from the world and living a life of monasticism, living a life in which we do not interact with people, in which we do not interact with the opportunities and the challenges of the world. But really, what we're talking about when we talk about dunya is not necessarily the world and everything that is in it, but everything that is in the world that is distracting and that takes a person's attention away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and takes a person away from the real and ultimate responsibilities that we have been given as human beings by the sovereign king. And so last week when we were together, we gave an analogy that is quite common in Sufi traditions, which is this idea that there's a young man who is called forth by the king of a dynasty, and he is told that the king would like to see you, and he wants to give you a responsibility. And so the man is very honored, and he says to himself, I've been chosen out of all the people by the king to do something for him. And he's very honored, and he goes to the king in much anticipation. And to make a long story short, the king gives him some money and says, go get such and such thing for the kingdom. And the young man says, absolutely, I will do this, and he's very honored to do it. And while he's on his way to the marketplace to get what the king has asked him to get, he sees what we would call in today's world an amusement park. A place where there's a lot of games and there's a lot of showmanship. And so he says to himself, I have a lot of time to fulfill my duties in getting what the king asked me to get. And so, it's okay if I just go for a little while to this amusement park and spend a little bit of time and a little bit of the money that I've been given, and the rest of it I'll fulfill my duty. So he starts playing and one amusement ride after another, one game after another, and the next thing he knows, the whole day has gone by and the sun is setting and the marketplace is closing, and he says to himself, oh my God, I've completely forgotten to do what the king asked me to do. So he goes running to the marketplace only to find that it has been closed and that he's not able to get what the king asked him to get. So he returns to the king, and you can imagine the response of the king. I sent you with money, and I sent you with time, and what did you do with that? So similarly, we as human beings have been placed into the world by the sovereign king. Malik Yawmiddin, the sovereign lord of the day of rising. And he has asked us to do certain things. But in our path, in our responsibility to do those certain things in the world and to achieve nearness to the sovereign king by doing those things in the world, there are always constantly these amusement parks that are attracting us. There's constantly these games and these activities that are distracting us from our ultimate purpose. And so renunciation, and so when we say you must renounce the world, it's not quite so accurate, because the world has been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have been put into the world for a purpose, and that is to fulfill certain responsibilities. And it is through our engagement with the world, it's by living in the world that we actually come close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the world is the place of trials and tests and tribulations. It is the means. Our time in the world is the means by which we draw near to the sovereign king. So when it says you must renounce the world, and when we talk about zuhud in general, we talk about renunciation, what we're really talking about is renunciation of those things that distract us from our responsibilities, that distract us from gaining nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that distract us from our responsibilities that have been given to us by the sovereign king. And zuhud is as much about renunciation as it is about non-attachment. Not necessarily non-possession, but really non-attachment, and that will be explained in due time. So as you're reading through this idea of renunciation, keep this concept in mind. Another example that some of the Sufis use is that they say that it's like the groom. It's kind of a funny example, but it's like the groom on the night of his night of his wedding, he becomes distracted with all the gifts and neglects his bride, and says, oh, look at this toaster that we've gotten, look at all these nice things we've gotten, and doesn't celebrate the night of the wedding. So to keep the ultimate purpose in mind is what's important. Just as loving the world is the origin of all sins, so also is hating it the origin of all obedience and excellence. So this is a point of disputation, this is a point of disagreement rather, between the scholars of the spiritual path as to what is the origin of all sins. A few scholars will say a few different things, but Imam al-Haddad is putting forth one of the positions that you'll find, which is that love of the world, hubb dunya, is really at the heart, is really at the origin of all sins. That is our over excessive zealousness and desire and want for everything in the world that leads us to stray from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made so much of the world halal and tayyib for us, we are by our very natures constantly seeking those few things which Allah ta'ala has told us are not good for us and has forbidden us to even go near. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. And so a proof of this reality is the fact that what we look in the story of Adam and Hawa, alayhi salam, Adam and Eve, peace be upon them both, that if we look at their narrative, if we look at their story, right, what we find is that they're in this paradise, they're in this garden that has everything that they can imagine and all these wonderful fruits and all of these wonderful things to enjoy from. But then Allah Ta'ala just tells them there's this one tree, just out of all the trees that are here, out of all the garden that's here, out of all the fruits that are here, there's just this one tree that I'm telling you, don't go near this tree, And ultimately, after some time, what do they want to do? They want to go to that tree. They want to see what is it, what's hidden in that tree? What is it that Allah Ta'ala has forbidden from us? And so this is part of the essential human nature that sometimes we forget about all of the things that Allah Ta'ala has made halal and tayyib, that Allah has made good and pure and permissible for us in the world, and we want to go after those things that Allah Ta'ala has made forbidden for us. And this is because of our overzealous attachment and love for the things of the world. And so Imam al-Haddad is saying, just as loving the world is the origin of all sins, so also is hating it the origin of all obedience and excellence. And again, when we're talking about world, we're talking about hating not the world, because again, we don't want to have this misperception that Imam al-Haddad and this path is about hating the world. It's really about hating those things that distract us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is what we mean when we say world, or really what we say in Arabic is dunya, and the way you can translate it in English more accurately than world is to say those things that distract us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is enough to make you renounce the world to know that in numerous passages in His book, Allah has called it the comfort of illusion. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the world as the comfort of illusion. That in reality, there's things about this world that are very illusory in their very nature. That they're fleeting by their very nature. And yet human beings constantly are attracted to this idea that we can gain permanent joy and we can gain permanent satisfaction and happiness by attaining to certain things or by enjoying certain things of the world. And so in that sense, it's very much an illusion, because the reality is that our joy and our happiness can only ultimately be found in the very real sense and in the very permanent sense in our closeness and in our intimacy with Allah Azza wa Jalla. And that Al-Hasan, and when he says Al-Hasan, he means Hasan al-Basri, and that Al-Hasan, may God have mercy on him, rahimahullah, said it is as the greenness of vegetation and the toys of girls. And so he's demeaning the distractions by saying it is as the greenness of vegetation and the toys of girls. And Abu Talib al-Makki, may God have mercy on him, said the comfort of illusion is a name for putrefying carcasses. So this is another description. In other words, bringing our attention to the real nature of those things in the world that we think we can find happiness in, but in reality we do not. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defined the world as being but a distraction and play to which no intelligent person should pay any attention, and to which only ignorant fools are attracted. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the life of the world is nothing but play and distraction. So what's really interesting here is that within the Quranic narrative itself, you find two different positions being taken about the nature of the world. In one ayah, Allah Ta'ala is saying that the life of this world is nothing but play and distraction and ornaments, and it's the place of illusion. But then on the other hand, we find passages in the Quran that say things like, Allah Ta'ala saying things like, we have not put you in this earth so that you might just play around. Right? It's not a place of li'ab. It's not a place of just playing around. There's a very serious purpose to life itself. So here within the Quranic paradigm itself, you can see how the world is being described in two different ways, that we have to take the world very seriously because this is the means by which we attain to nearness to Allah, and it is the means by which we return to the home that we lost. But at the same time, we have to be careful of those illusions that are there within the world, the amusement parks that are there within the world. Know that to renounce the world is an immediate felicity, and that only those whose breasts God has opened up by the dawning of the lights of gnosis and certainty are capable of it. So one of the most profound things that we read in this entire book is this very line that says, know that to renounce the world is an immediate felicity. So the reality is that zuhud, or renunciation, it's interesting because the idea is going without. And so as much as the human being is attracted to this idea that the more we have, the more we will be happy, the more that we will be in a state of felicity. What the spiritual path really teaches is that, in fact, it's the opposite. That, in fact, the less that you have, the more that you're going to find yourself to be happy, the more that you're going to find yourself to be in a state of felicity. The reality is that the more you have, the more things you have to take care of, and the more responsibilities come upon your head, and the larger things that you have, it becomes that much easier to become attached to those things, so that when those things leave us, it becomes that much more difficult to deal with the reality of life. And part of the reality of life is that we will ultimately lose all of those things that we are attached to one by one in our lives. So, if we have, if we have a really big house, and big car, all of these things, it is easier for our hearts to become attached to those things. But when those things are taken away, it's so much harder for us to deal with the loss of that thing. But if we keep ourselves to simple means and we keep ourselves to simplicity, then what we find is that when those things go away, we might feel some level of detachment, but it's not as big of a deal. So know that to renounce the world is an immediate felicity, and that only those whose breasts God has opened up by the dawning of the lights of gnosis and certainty are capable of it. So it is only by Allah Ta'ala's placing light through the spiritual path and certainty in the promises of Allah that one is able to achieve this renunciation. The Prophet ﷺ has said, when light enters the heart, it opens up and is enlarged. So when Allah Ta'ala's light enters the heart, it opens up and it is enlarged. The companion said, is there any sign for that? And he ﷺ replied, yes, to shun the abode of illusion and to attend to the abode of immortality. So one of the signs that we should look out for to know whether this light is present in our hearts or not, or how strong or how weak this light is in our hearts, is to ask ourselves, how much do we work for the dunya? How much do we work for those illusions? How much do we work for those fleeting illusions that we think will make us happy? and how much do we work, how much time do we put into it, and how much energy do we put into attaining to those things. In other words, attaining to those good deeds, attaining to those things that will benefit us when we go into our grave and when we stand before Allah Ta'ala on the Day of Judgment, and when we are in the presence of Allah, inshallah, in the afterlife. So how much time are we devoting to one or the other, right? And so that is a sign for us. And he, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, said, renouncing the world relieves the heart and the body, while desire for the world increases worry and sorrow. And so the same idea is repeated again, that human nature that we have to think that the more we have, the happier we will be. The spiritual path is telling us a very important truth, which is that it's actually the opposite. Renouncing the world relieves the heart and the body. It relieves the heart and the body, while desire for the world increases worry and sorrow. And the Prophet ﷺ said, renounce the world and God will love you. Renounce the world and God will love you. You know, because the nature of the beloved, the nature of the lover, is that the lover is jealous. And the lover wants you to only love, him. Right? So, in other words, if you start loving other things, the lover starts saying, what are you doing? Don't you love me enough? Isn't your love for me strong enough? They want to constantly see that. And so the more that we are able to non-attach ourselves to the things, the fleeting things of this world, the more that we will find Allah Ta'ala's love there for us. The origin of renunciation is the heart's knowledge, and inshallah we'll talk more about this idea of love. This is the final chapter that we will go over. So I know there's some questions that come out of this concept. Does that mean we can't love our spouse or question? No. It doesn't mean that at all. Inshallah we'll get to it. The origin of renunciation is the heart's knowledge of the vileness and insignificance of the world, and that had it been worth so much as a gnat's wing to God, He would not have given a disbeliever a sip of its water. So if it was really valuable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He would not give those who reject Him even a sip of its water. And that it is accursed, and all that it contains except that which is for God, except that which is for God. See, this is the clarification that is needed here. Except that which is for God. So everything in the dunya meaning the things that take us away from Allah, except that which is for God, is accursed. And that anyone who takes more than is necessary from it is unwittingly taking his own destruction. And so this is one of the things that we find. I mean, let's think just for an example, the BP oil spill, right? This overzealous desire to have all of the world's oil, and then what happens? People start, making shortcuts. People start becoming irresponsible in this overzealous desire to have all of the world's oil, and they start doing things that are very unnatural to the planet, and they start affecting, or they start poisoning the ocean and the animals that are there in this overzealous desire for that what they call black hole. And then what happens? It becomes a disaster. It becomes a big disaster. And so this is an example that we find in society, but at the individual level as well, in our own personal lives, we find this to be true as well. That if we take more than what we need from the world, even though we think that it will be something that will make us happy, in fact what it does is that it leads to our own destruction. The intended result of such knowledge is to abandon inwardly desire for the world. So inwardly, to try to detach ourselves from desiring those things that distract us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to abandon outwardly delighting in its pleasures. And so inwardly detaching ourselves, and outwardly removing ourselves as much as possible from those things. And so this idea of non-possession versus non-attachment is a very important idea to entertain for just a moment. Generally speaking, there's a big difference between non-possession and non-attachment. So zuhud is not necessarily about non-possession, because the one who does not possess might in fact be worse off than the person who possesses if day in and day out their only concern that keeps them up at night and keeps them very worried is how to attain to that thing which they don't have. You see what I'm saying? So it might sound like, oh, I don't have that thing, so this is renunciation. That's not renunciation. To renounce something is to be content with what you have, and to not overly seek those things beyond what is needed, and to be distressed about those things when we do not achieve them, or to not be overly attached to them when we do achieve them. So it is not really about possession, but it's about attachment. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there is, despite theoretically the fact that people can have something but not be attached to it, the fact is that when we have something, most likely our nature as human beings is that we become attached to it as well. And so we have to really ask ourselves, how much of what we have do we really need? And really ask ourselves that question constantly, because the reality is that once it is in our possession, most likely the fact will be that we will also become attached to it. We will not just possess it. The lowest degree of renunciation is that one is not induced by the world to commit a sin. So the lowest degree of renunciation, which is, even though it's considered the lowest, it's very important. It is the expectation on every single believer to at least try their best to reach this level, at least this level of zuhud, at least this level of renunciation, that whatever they are induced to by the world, they do not commit a sin by the nature of that inducement, nor to neglect any act of obedience, while the highest degree is that you take nothing from it unless you know that to take it is more pleasing to God than to leave it. So the lowest is that you do not sin and you do not neglect your acts of obedience in pursuit of the world and its pleasures. But the highest, and inshallah ta'ala, we're called to be high human beings, and we're told that we're molded in the best of fashions, and so we have to aim for what is high. The highest of zuhud is that we take nothing from the world unless we know that it is more pleasing to